Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to really get into GDPR.
Oh yeah, big topic.
GDPR, it's one of those things you need to know, especially as a new compliance officer.
Absolutely essential knowledge.
And, I have to admit, when I saw all this material on GDPR, I was like, whoa.
Yeah,
It's a lot to get through, but we're going to break it down.
for sure.
We're going to make it fun.
We'll make it fun and easy.
Okay, so let's start with the very basics, I guess. What is GDPR? And why should anyone even care?
Well, GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, it's a set of rules from the EU that really changed how companies all over the world collect, use, and store people's data. It's about, giving individuals control over their information.
Interesting. So it's not just some Europe-specific law. This affects everyone.
Yeah, pretty much. If a company anywhere in the world is handling data from EU citizens, they got to follow GDPR. It's a pretty big deal. It's kind of set a new standard for data protection globally. It went into effect on May 25, 2018, and that was a big day. A lot of companies had to scramble.
Wow, so that's a date to remember then. I can see why compliance officers need to be all over this. So what are the main, principles of GDPR? What are we talking about here?
So GDPR has these 7 core principles, like the pillars of data protection. It's about creating a culture of respecting data privacy, not just ticking boxes. And to be honest, these principles, some companies really struggle with them.
Interesting. Okay, let's break them down then. What's the first one, the first pillar they need to worry about?
Right. First up is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Basically, companies can't just grab data and use it however they want. They need a solid legal reason, and they got to be upfront with people about how they're using their data. No more hiding behind, complicated privacy policies nobody understands.
So basically it's about being open and honest, right? What's the next big principle then?
Next is purpose limitation. Data can only be used for the specific reason it was collected for in the first place. So let's say you run an online store, someone buys, I don't know, a pair of shoes from you. You can't then use their data to send them ads for political campaigns or whatever.
So no more just collecting tons of data and then using it for anything you feel like.
Right. GDPR is trying to make data practices more, ethical. Now, this next principle, data minimization, this is where some companies really get tripped up.
Okay, data minimization. Why is that one so tough for them?
It's about being efficient. Only collect the data you actually need for that specific purpose. A lot of companies, they have this idea that more data is always better, but GDPR really flips that on its head.
Yeah, that makes sense. It forces you to think carefully about what you're collecting and why. So less is more, huh? What's the next one on our list?
The fourth one is accuracy. Got to keep that data accurate and up to date. Sounds simple, but in practice, oh boy, especially for big companies with loads of data.
Yeah, because if your data's wrong, things can go very wrong, right?
Absolutely. Imagine sending in a package to the wrong address because your data's outdated.
Hmm.
Or even worse, deciding someone can't get a loan based on bad data. The consequences can be huge.
Right, it's not just about good bookkeeping. It's about being fair and preventing harm.
Sure.
Okay, what's the next principle we need to know about?
Fifth one is storage limitation. GDPR recognizes that data.I doesn't age well, like wine. The longer you keep data, the riskier it gets. So companies got to set time limits for how long they keep different kinds of data and then get rid of it securely when it's not needed anymore.
So data has an expiration date. Interesting. What if they just ignore that and keep it forever?
Well, that's breaking the rules, right?
Yeah.
And that can lead to big fines under GDPR. Plus, it's just a security risk waiting to happen. Why keep stuff you don't need?
Good point. Seems like this principle helps with security A&D compliance. What's next on our list of these data protection pillars?
Next, we have integrity and confidentiality. This one is all about security, making sure the data is safe. Think of it like, I don't know, a digital Fort Knox, protecting that data from hackers, leaks, or anything like that.
Yeah, that sounds super important. What kind of measures are we talking about here?
It's got to be a multi-layered approach. You need the technical stuff like encryption, strong passwords, and all that, but also the human side. Good policies, training for staff, making sure everyone knows how to handle data properly.
So it's technology and E&D people working together. What's the last principle companies need to be aware of?
The seventh and final principle is accountability. This is the one that ties it all together. Companies have to prove they're actually following all the other principles. It's not enough to just say they're doing it. They got to have the paperwork, the systems, everything to show they're compliant.
So actions speak louder than words, basically.
Exactly. Accountability is about taking responsibility for data protection. and showing you're doing it right. This one often gets overlooked, but it's so important for building trust with people and with the regulators too, especially these days with all the data breaches and privacy scandals happening.
That makes a lot of sense. You got to be proactive and show you're taking it seriously. Okay, so those are the 7 key principles of GDPR. Sounds kind of simple on the surface, but I can already imagine how tricky it can get in real life.
Oh, for sure. And we're just scratching the surface here. There's a lot more to it. All those legal terms, data subject rights, and the whole world of compliance. But before we get into all that, maybe we should define some of those key terms just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, let's do that. Decode some of that GDPR jargon. What are some of the terms that trip people up the most?
I think one that often causes confusion is personal data. It seems like it should be simple, but you'd be surprised how many companies don't quite get it.
So what is personal data under GDPR? Like what's considered sensitive?
GDPR says personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person.
Okay.
Bit of a mouthful, but it basically means anything that can be used to identify someone directly or indirectly.
Okay, so like names, addresses, social security numbers, that's obvious, right? But what about stuff that's not so obvious?
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. Think about things like IP addresses online, cookie data, or location data from your phone. Even data that seems anonymous, if you can link it back to a person, boom, it's personal data.
So the definition is pretty broad then. What about the actual person whose data is being used? Is there a specific term for them?
Yeah, in GDPR, they're called the data subject.
So the data subject is at the center of all this.
Exactly. GDPR is all about giving data subjects control, making sure they have the power over their information.
I see. Okay, so then what about those other terms I keep hearing, like data controller and data processor? What's the difference?
That's a really important distinction, yeah. And it can be tricky because sometimes a company can be both.
Okay, so break it down for me. What's the main difference between controller and processor?
So the data controller is the one who decides why and how personal data is being processed. They're in charge. They decide what to collect, how to use it, all that.
So they're the ones calling the shots, basically.
Right. Think of it like this. Your company uses a payroll company, right? Your company is the data controller for your employees' data. You decide what's needed for payroll. But the payroll company, they're the data processor.
Oh, okay. So the processor is the one actually handling the data, but they're following the controller's instructions.
Exactly. The processor acts on behalf of the controller and can only process that data according to their instructions.
And they can't just go off and do whatever they want with it.
Nope, not at all. The processor has obligations under GDPR to keep the data safe, confidential, and they got to follow those instructions to the letter. They can't decide, oh, let's use this for marketing or something.
Got it. Now there's another term that gets thrown around, DPO. What exactly is a DPO, and what do they do in all of this?
DPO stands for Data Protection Officer. It's a role that's becoming, well, super important in any company that deals with a lot of personal data.
So like a beta superhero, protecting everyone's privacy.
Haha. Yeah, you could say that. They're the ones making sure the company's doing things right when it comes to data protection.
Okay, so what are their actual responsibilities? Like, what do they do all day?
They advise the company on anything related to data protection, make sure they're following GDPR, train staff, do those data protection impact assessments we talked about, and they're the point of contact for anyone who has questions about their data.
Wow, that sounds like a lot. They must have to know GDPR inside and out.
They do. They play a really important role, making sure companies are meeting their obligations and protecting people's rights.
I'm guessing not every company needs a DPO, though, right?
Right. GDPR says certain types of organizations have VE to have a DPO, like public authorities, companies that process a ton of sensitive data, or companies that are constantly monitoring individuals.
So it depends on how much data they handle and what they're doing with it. Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered personal data, data subject, data controller, data processor, and DPO. What other key terms do I need to be fluent in?
The last big one is processing. And it may sound simple, but it's actually very broad.
Okay, so what does processing really mean under GDPR?
Processing means any operation you do with personal data, with or without computers.
So it's not just collecting the data, it's anything you do with it.
Yep. Collecting, recording, organizing, changing, storing, using, sharing, deleting. Basically anything you do with that data is considered processing.
Okay, it's a catch-all term then. So we've tackled some of that GDPR lingo, but what about my rights as an individual? What does GDPR do to actually give people more control over their data?
That's the good stuff. GDPR gives individuals a whole bunch of rights to make sure they have a say in how their information is used. It's about shifting the power, giving some back to the people.
Okay, I like the sound of that. What are these data subject rights and how can I use them?
One of the most basic rights is the right of access. You have the right to ask a company if they're processing your data, and if they are, you can see it,
So I can just go up to a company and say, hey, show me what you have on me.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And they have to give you a copy for free and explain what they're doing with it. This gives people transparency and lets them check if companies are playing by the rules.
That's awesome. What if I find out they have something wrong, like my address is outdated or something?
You can fix that. GDPR gives you the right to rectification. You can ask them to correct any inaccurate or incomplete data they have about you. This makes sure they're using the right information when making decisions about you.
So I can basically fact check my own data file. I like it. What other rights do I have?
This one gets a lot of attention, the right to erasure. It's also called the right to be forgotten.
Hmm.
You can ask a company to delete your data under certain conditions.
Wait, so I could actually disappear from a company's records completely?
It is a powerful right, but it's not a blank check. There are specific rules about when it applies.
Okay, so what are those rules? Like, when can I actually tell a company to delete my data?
For example, if the data is not needed anymore for the reason they collected it, if you withdraw your consent, or if they were processing it unlawfully. There are other situations too, but those are some of the most common ones.
So it's not like I can just demand any company to delete my data for any reason. There are rules.
Exactly. There are safeguards to make sure this right is used responsibly and doesn't mess things up for other legitimate reasons.
Makes sense. What if I don't want my data totally deleted, but I want to put some limits on how a company can use it? Is that possible?
Yeah, GDPR's got you covered there too. It's called the right to restriction of processing. You can ask a company to limit how they're using your data.
So setting some boundaries, basically. When would I want to do that?
Maybe you're arguing about whether the data is accurate, or you think they're processing it unlawfully, or you need the data for some legal thing. It gives you more control, even if you don't want it fully deleted.
Interesting. Like setting some ground rules for how they can interact with my information. What else is there? Any other rights that give me more control?
Yep, you've got the right to data portability. This one is all about making it easy for you to move your data from one company to another.
That sounds pretty useful these days. How does that work?
Basically, you can get your data from a company in a format that's easy to understand and transfer to another company.
So if I'm switching banks or email providers, I can take my data with me. No need to start from scratch.
Right. It encourages competition because you're not stuck with one company just because they have all your data. You have more freedom to choose.
That's a great right to have, for sure. What if I just straight up don't want a company to use my data for certain things? Can I say no to them?
Absolutely. You have the right to object. You can object to them processing your data if you have a good reason, especially if they're doing it based on their legitimate interests or for direct marketing.
So if I don't want those marketing emails or to be profiled based on what I do online, I can object.
You bet. And they have to stop unless they have a really, really good reason that outweighs your rights.
It's nice to have some power back, I gotta say. Are there any other data subject rights I should be aware of?
One more category, and this one is becoming super important with all the AI and algorithms these days. It's the rights related to automated decision-making and profiling.
Now that sounds kind of futuristic. What does that even mean? Like robots deciding my fate?
Not robots exactly, but algorithms. Yeah. This right is about making sure humans aren't just being judged by computer programs, especially when those decisions have a big impact on their lives.
So if a company uses an algorithm to decide if I can get a loan or a job, I have some rights.
In certain situations, yes. You have the right to know that it's happening, to get an explanation how that algorithm works, and to challenge the decision if you think it's unfair.
So GDPR is trying to keep humans in control, even in this age of AI and automation.
Exactly. It's about making sure people aren't treated unfairly by these systems. These rights are a big part of what GDPR is trying to do, protect people in this digital age.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The principles, the terminology, and all these rights data subjects have. GDPR is definitely about protecting individuals, but I'm sure companies are wondering, okay, when can we actually use this data? What are the rules?
That's the key question, and it's super important for staying compliant. GDPR doesn't just give people rights and leave companies hanging. It lays out how and when they can lawfully use personal data. And those rules are based on what are called lawful bases, which is what we'll look at next.
So there are rules for companies too. Interesting. What are these lawful bases and how do they work?
Yeah, so GDPR has these very specific rules for when you're allowed to process someone's data, and they're called lawful bases.
Yeah.
There are 6 main ones companies got to know.
Okay, 6 lawful bases. Let's take them one by one. I guess starting with where do we start?
I think the simplest one to grasp is consent.
Okay.
That's where the person, the data subject, they clearly say, yes, you can use my data for this specific purpose.
So like those little boxes we click online, those actually matter?
They do, but only if they're done right. GDPR is strict about consent. It has to be freely given, specific, informed, no pre-checked boxes or hiding it in tiny print.
So no more sneaky tricks. Consent has to be real. What about situations where consent doesn't really work or isn't the right approach? What other lawful bases are there?
Another common one is contractual necessity. That means you need that data to fulfill a contract with someone.
Like, what's an example of that?
Sure, think of an online store. They need your payment info and address to ship you something, right? That's contractual necessity. No way to do the service without processing that data.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, what else?
You've also got legal obligation. That's when the law requires you to process data. Think about taxes or employment records or anti-money laundering rules. Companies have no choice there. Got to follow the law.
So sometimes it's the law itself that says you got to process this. Okay, that's clear enough. What about if there's no contract, no law specifically saying to do it, but the company thinks they have a good reason to use the data?
Well, then you get into legitimate interests territory. This one can be tricky. It's where a lot of debate happens.
Why is that one so controversial or confusing?
It's about finding the right balance. The company has to show they have a legitimate reason, a real interest, in processing the data, but that can't just override people's rights.
So there's got to be a justification, but it can't just trample all over individual rights.
Got it. Give me an example of something that might be a legitimate interest.
Sure, let's say a company wants to analyze how people are using their website, just to make it better, improve the design, that kind of thing.
Okay.
That could be a legitimate interest. Or maybe they use security cameras to prevent theft. That makes sense. But in both cases, they got to make sure it's proportionate, not going overboard and impacting people's privacy too much.
So finding that sweet spot where the company benefits but people's rights aren't ignored. Okay, we've got 4 lawful bases down. What are the last 2? You've got vital interests, which is basically you need that data to literally save someone's life or prevent serious harm. That one's pretty rare, mostly for emergencies.
Like life or death situations.
Exactly. And the last one is public task, which is processing data needed for some official purpose, like government stuff, census data, that kind of thing.
Okay, so GDPR has thought of a lot of different scenarios. It's not just a free-for-all. There's always a specific rule or reason. But with all this complexity, how can companies even be sure they're doing it right, following all the rules?
That's where knowing the law inside out is crucial, but also doing something called a Data Protection Impact Assessment, or DPIA.
DPIA, right, we mentioned that earlier. Remind me what that is again?
It's like a risk assessment, specifically for data projects. You look at how the project might affect people's privacy, especially if you're dealing with sensitive data or new technologies.
So before a company does anything new with data, they got to stop and think about the privacy implications, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Asking questions like, what are we collecting? Why do we need it? How will we use it? How long will we keep it? What could go wrong? And what can we do to minimize those risks?
So building data protection into the plan from the start, not just adding it on later as an afterthought.
Exactly. And these DPIAs, they're not just paperwork. They can lead to real changes in how the company handles data.
Okay, so it's not just ticking a box, it's about making a real difference. Now, let's talk security for a minute. We all hear about those data breaches, companies getting hacked and all that. What does GDPR say about keeping our data safe?
Security is a huge part of GDPR. Companies have to take appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect data from unauthorized access, hacking, leaks, all that. It's not enough to just say you care. You
Yeah.
got to do something about it.
So what are some of those appropriate measures? Like, what should companies be doing to keep our data safe?
Well, it depends on the data and the risks, but you're talking about things like encryption, access controls, pseudonymization, regular security testing, and having a plan for what to do if something goes wrong.
Okay, a lot of different things. What's encryption? I hear that word a lot, but not sure I fully get it.
Encryption is basically scrambling the data. So it's unreadable unless you have the key to unscramble it. It's a good way to protect data, both when it's being sent somewhere and when it's just stored.
So even if hackers get it, they can't read it without the key. like a lock on the data.
Exactly. And then you have access controls, which is all about limiting who can see the data. Not everyone in the company needs access to everything, right?
Makes sense.
So you're going to have systems that control who can see what based on their job, what they need to know. This helps prevent unauthorized access, people snooping around where they shouldn't.
So the right people seeing the right data for the right reasons. Okay, what about pseudonymization? It's a long word.
Pseudonymization, yeah. That's basically replacing the real identifying information with fake names or codes, so it's harder to figure out who it belongs to. It reduces the risk, but you can still use the data for some things.
So it's kind of like giving people anonymity while still letting the data be useful. What about security testing? What's that all about?
That's regularly checking for weaknesses in your systems before the hackers find them. Things like penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, really probing for those weak spots and fixing them before they become a problem.
Okay, like a regular checkup for your security. And what was that last one about having a plan if something goes wrong?
Incident response planning, yeah.
Yeah.
Even with the best security, sometimes bad stuff happens. Breaches can still occur.
Yeah, that's true.
So you need a clear plan for what to do if a breach does happen, how to contain it, investigate it, notify the authorities, and fix the problem.
So you're ready for anything, basically.
Exactly. Having a good plan in place can really minimize the damage and make sure you're following GDPR even when things go sideways.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've covered those lawful bases for processing data, the DPIAs, and all those security measures. It's a lot to think about, but what if, even with all that, a company still has a data breach? What happens then under GDPR?
GDPR has very specific rules about what you have to do if there's a breach. If there's a data breach and it's likely to harm people's rights, the company has to tell the authorities right away within 72 hours.
72 hours, that's not a lot of time. Why the rush?
It's about getting the word out fast so the authorities can start investigating and hopefully limit the damage. The faster everyone acts, the better chance you have of containing it and protecting people.
Gotcha. What about telling the people whose data was actually affected? Do they have to be notified too?
Sometimes, yeah. If the breach is likely to cause a high risk to those individuals, the company has to tell them too, and they can't delay.
So being open and honest is important here too. People need to know what happened so they can protect themselves.
All right, it's all about transparency. And the notification has to explain what happened, what data was involved, what could happen because of the breach, and what the company is doing to fix it.
Okay, so there's a whole process for handling breaches. But what if companies just ignore all these rules? Are there consequences for that, or is GDPR just a suggestion?
Oh, GDPR has teeth, for sure. It's not just a set of nice guidelines. There are real penalties for not following the rules.
Okay, lay it on me. What are the penalties? What are companies risking if they don't take this seriously?
The authorities have a lot of power. They can give warnings, reprimands, force companies to fix things, and even issue big fines. And we're talking potentially millions of euros.
Wow, so they're not messing around. I can
Sure.
see why this is so crucial for compliance officers, but with everything we've talked about, where does a new compliance officer even begin? What are the first steps to make sure their company is doing things right?
It can definitely feel overwhelming, all this stuff. But I'd say the best starting point is a good old-fashioned data audit. It's about knowing what data you have, where it is, all that.
And what does a data audit involve exactly?
Basically, you figure out what personal data your company collects, uses, and stores, where it comes from, where it's kept, who has access to it, what you're using it for, how long you're keeping it. It's like taking inventory of all your data.
So it's the foundation, basically. You got to know what you have before you can protect it, right?
Absolutely. Once you have that clear picture of your data landscape, then you can start making policies, procedures, all that to make sure you're compliant with GDPR.
Okay, data audit, check. What's next on the list?
Got to review those privacy policies, make sure they're clear, easy to understand, and up to date with all the GDPR requirements.
So no more hiding behind complicated legal language, right? People need to understand what's going on with their data.
Transparency is key.
Hmm.
That privacy policy should explain in plain English what you collect, how you use it, what people's rights are, how you protect it, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, privacy policy, check. Now, what about the people in the company who are actually using that data every day?
Yeah, got to train those staff. Anyone handling personal data needs to know the GDPR rules, their responsibilities, all that.
So everyone's on the same page. What kind of training are we talking about here?
The training should cover the basics of GDPR, those data subject rights, how to handle data securely, and the company's own specific policies for data protection. It's about creating a culture of data privacy where everyone understands it's important.
Okay, training. Got it. What else is crucial for staying compliant?
You also need clear procedures for how to handle everything data related, like what to do if someone asks to see their data, what to do if there's a breach, how to handle all those data protection issues.
So like a playbook,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. Having those procedures makes it way easier to follow the rules and helps prevent mistakes. Plus, it shows the regulators that you're taking it seriously.
That's really helpful advice. I feel like I understand GDPR so much better now. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners, especially those new compliance officers out there?
I'd say approach GDPR with a positive attitude. It's not just about avoiding those fines, it's about doing things right, building a culture of privacy in your company, and earning people's trust.
I like that, seeing it as a chance to improve things, not just a bunch of rules to follow.
Exactly. Embrace the challenge, ask questions. There are tons of people out there who know this stuff and are happy to help. You're not alone in this.
That's great advice. And remember, listeners, you're not alone on this journey. We're all figuring this out together.
We are. It's a constantly evolving world.
So, to sum it all up, GDPR is all about protecting people's rights in this digital age. It sets out clear rules for companies, how they can use our data, and it gives us, the individuals, a whole set of rights to control our own information.
It's complex, for sure, but it's really important. It's changing how data privacy works globally. And for compliance officers, it's essential.
We've covered a lot of ground, the seven principles, the jargon, those data subject rights, lawful bases, DPIAs, security, breach notification, the whole thing. Hopefully you're feeling a bit more informed now and maybe a little less
A little
overwhelmed.
more empowered too,
For
right?
sure. Now, here's a final thought to chew on. If GDPR is setting a new standard globally, what does that mean for the future of technology? Are we headed towards a more privacy-focused world online? What do you think? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into GDPR. Hope you found it helpful, interesting, and maybe even a little bit fun. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay in control of your data.